All right in the middle of Obamacare enrollment, a judge in Texas has ruled that Obamacare itself is unconstitutional, more to the point that a key funding mechanism for it, the so-called individual mandate, that you got to get health insurance, isn't wise. He goes on to say, I'm referring to Judge Reed O'Connor, that it can no longer be sustained as an exercise of Congress's tax power. Now, this will no doubt be appealed, but the back and forth continues. The read on all of this and what it might mean for the future of health care, and particularly Obamacare, with former New York Congresswoman Nan Hayworth. We got Democratic strategist Jessica Tarlov and Fox News contributor Katherine Timpf. Kat, what do you think of what happens now?
Well, obviously, it's going to be appealed, and this is going to be an ongoing battle for quite some time. And it's interesting because the individual mandate was already struck down. Well, the penalty wasn't technically struck down. The penalty was just reduced to $0. But I think that it is unconstitutional. I'm surprised that it actually passed in the first place. So I think that this is exciting news, even though I don't know ultimately if it will end up being struck down or not, or if it will even make it to the Supreme Court.
All right, well, that depends on some legal vehicles here. But, Nan, you can always say that it's going to be framed through political prisms, right? I mean, Democrats are going to say millions are going to lose their insurance, people are going to die. Republicans are going to say millions of people will save money now, they're not going to die, and on we go.
And in fact, Neil, the statistics show that the folks who gained insurance coverage through Obamacare were primarily folks who gained through the Medicaid expansion, which is a separate argument. But basically what Obamacare forced millions of Americans to do who are in the individual markets who could least afford this was the government compelled them to buy insurance policies that effectively were overpriced for what they needed. And that's been the entire thrust of the president's arguments and of the Republicans' arguments, that people should not be forced to buy insurance that's more costly than they need and that provides for things that they don't necessarily need. So,
but it is going to spook those signing up for it, right? I mean, you're going to think twice about.
If you are watching right now, Obamacare still exists. The deadline is coming up. Please register and sign up. If it goes back to the Supreme Court, the same 5 justices who voted to preserve it are still sitting on the court, and I imagine that their decision will be the same. But what I'm struck by is the Republicans that are rejoicing in this after the 2018 election, where it was very clear that health care was the #1 issue and that people wanted to maintain pre-existing conditions. And a number of Republicans went out there and actually lied about their longstanding position on pre-existing conditions in order to get people to vote for them. What this judge has done is called all of that work that those Republicans who were smart enough to pivot into question. Because what are they going to do now? The Republicans still
You're saying they lied about as much as they said put the powers in states and said the states themselves could decide.
They lied by saying, I have always been there. They're on the record. We have the tape, roll tape, as they say, saying that they want to repeal and replace Obamacare. They will have another plan, which they never did, that was viable. And then they come back and they say, we always wanted to protect your pre-existing conditions.
Did Democrats lie in any of this when they misrepresented the cost of this, what was covered in this?
I've done that.
So there's been bipartisan lying
I'm
going
saying
on.
after you lose 40 seats in the House, you should, and healthcare as the #1 issue, you should not be rejoicing in a fight over something that the American public wants. Put forward a viable.
Do they want this? Do they want this?
Well, they want it. Really, a lot of people want Medicare for all, which I think is where the Democrats will now shift to say we've got to make sure everyone is protected.
It's not a matter of, I would, Jesse, with respect, I would dispute your premise. Republicans have always been for everyone having access to insurance that they can afford, and that includes allowing states who are the best at taking care of their local citizenry to allow them flexibility with Medicaid so that, yes, folks who have pre-existing conditions in particular can be better provided for than they are. Millions of Americans have lost their insurance under Obamacare.
It is true that Republicans really dropped the ball on this. They had the chance to fix this. They had,
I agree.
They had the House, they had the Senate, they had the presidency. And
but we didn't have 60 votes in the Senate.
All they did was fight over this. And it is a complicated issue, and it is an emotional issue when you're talking about health care, health insurance.
Overturn this if it did get to that? What would happen?
I don't think so, because as Jessica said, there's 5 justices that voted to protect it are still on the court, so I don't think that it would get to that point.
But what's changed by law is that now the individual mandate, although technically it still exists, is $0. So then the IRS isn't collecting anything.
We shall see. And there's no way of guaranteeing a repeat vote that would turn out the exact same way in the United States Supreme Court. Nevertheless, we are going to get the read from Missouri Democratic Congressman Emanuel Cleaver on all of this. He's been a big believer that the law, flawed as it is still the best thing for the American people. Is he right after this?
Clearly, there's a lot of dissatisfaction in France. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in the UK and even here in Germany. In France, I think it's clear that we can't have protectionist policies. We've got to have free and fair trade and trade policies. We've got to believe in capitalism. And I think that people don't want to take the brunt of policy programs that are clearly not geared towards them.
All right, our ambassador to Germany, Rick Cornell, talking about the protests that have been going on all day. Things are a little bit quieter now along the Champs-Élysées in Paris. But again, there's been a lot of friction there over a government big enough to give folks a lot of the stuff they want, but apparently the problem is paying for it. Back with me is Kat Timpf and Jessica Tarlov, and we've got Nan Hayworth. Kat, the issue again is just how far can governments go to give people stuff and then expect that stuff to be paid for. There are limits, obviously, but how does this play out?
Well, what's interesting is that it seems to be playing out in favor of the protesters. They've already gotten some of the things that they want. And it's interesting because that doesn't really happen in the United States. And I think one reason for that is there's more widespread support for these protesters beyond just the protesters themselves. The polls show that 68% of people in France actually support this movement, where I think in the United States we almost kind of look down on protesters a lot, like, oh, you're annoying, you're blocking traffic, you know, don't these bums have to work? And it's a lot different in France.
And all the protesters to the protesters sound exactly like that.
That's my protester. Protester
they just have a French accent.
They do, yeah.
I can't do it
French accent. I was practicing it in the green room, but it wasn't ready in time.
But the whole nature of what they're protesting is, in this case, these are people who feel disenfranchised. You know, they do live, as you mentioned, Neil, and you're right. They live in a society in which entrepreneurialism, enterprise, the things that we value that allow us to rise and to be independent, have been overwhelmed entirely by an enormous government structure that can impose on them in this way. And they're saying, well, we're going to take care of climate change by taxing your gas. And they say, well, why are we the ones constantly being required to pay for it? In this country, you know, our street protesters tend to be arguing for more government imposition.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know what's interesting in all of this, and I follow the poll numbers of all the major world leaders, and it's interesting whether you're talking Macron or Angela Merkel in Germany, Theresa May in Britain, what's been happening across the globe is their numbers combined aren't what Donald Trump's are right now.
It's quite amazing.
And it's amazing how widespread it is. And these are the same folks who were snickering at him last time he was in Europe. I don't know who's right or wrong on this, but I do find it's like upside down world now.
Well, all the countries that we're talking about do have free and fair elections, so we'll find out who is right there. Angela Merkel.
Well, wait a minute. You're not implying that we do not.
No, I'm not. I'm saying this isn't going on in the Philippines or in Russia.
Understood.
So people will have their day to vote them out if that's what they choose to do. Macron is at 26% right now, and if you know, follow the news like we do, you would think that he had 100% approval. With
That's
he
still
has
more
the
popular than
swagger
Nancy Pelosi, actually.
All right, we had to get in the dig. We were having a Nancy-free day here, Nan, and I still loved her last week. But it is important to think about that, and Rick was correct to point out that this is something that is going on all over Western Europe. But in these countries, they also have organized labor on a larger level than we do. They have societal benefits that many on the left would like us to have across the board, you know, a better education system for all, health care for all,
but also enormous unemployment.
They do, absolutely, which is what Macron is being served with
But we
right
might
now.
follow them if we shut our government down this week. Someone's going to take the blame for that.
Well,
now, the
Trump
president says he is happy to take the blame.
Senate Democrats.
Right.
Senate Democrats.
Now, where does that go?
Where does what go? The shutdown?
Shut down.
I think that Trump will take the blame for it, but I don't think any of his supporters will care because they'll say, oh, he's doing it for border security. He's standing up for this wall. He's not backing down the way other Republicans have in the past. So I don't think it'll affect him politically at all.
No, I agree.
Nancy Pelosi laying it out with Chuck Schumer in the White House that would be a bad move. I'm just wondering politically how you think it falls out.
Well, I think we were talking about this yesterday on the Outnumbered couch with Chris Wilson, who worked for Ted Cruz, Republican, and he even admitted no matter who was actually responsible for shutdowns, Republicans consistently get the blame for it. That's just the way that it works.
Well, they didn't get the blame for the last one.
Schumer
That didn't last long.
It didn't last long, and I feel as though Republicans are really only the ones who use that term. Democrats don't remember it anymore. They remember now Nancy Pelosi fact-checking President Trump to his face about it, and President Trump saying, I'll take the blame here.
Well, two things are wrong with what you said. First of all, you're quoting another show you're on.
Sorry, this is the only show I have ever been on.
Exactly. And the other, this idea that, you know, it tends to represent a pox on only Republican houses. I just wonder this go-round whether we're sadly getting used to it and no one really cares.
Well, I think there is a lot of, I was in Congress, as we all know, Neil, and there is a lot of cynicism, rightly placed. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that individual districts expect certain things of their members of Congress. You know, they want their members of Congress to bring home certain benefits, bring home the bacon. And yet, when that occurs on a mass scale, then we tend to be very dissatisfied as taxpayers because we're the ones paying for bloated, inefficient government.
Can I also add, and this loops back to what we were talking about in our first segment of health care, that is the #1 issue for Republicans and Democrats. I think that the president, who has spoken about health care in a much more calming way than a lot of other Republicans, saying, I want to make sure people have entitlements, I want to make sure pre-existing conditions are protected, could do a lot to move off the immigration talk. I know he's never going to be able to give it up, and for the rallies,
I don't see that happening.
No, but it would be tactically more intelligent to talk about the things that the American public said was the #1 issue for them.
I don't see Democrats giving that up either.
I think giving up the border wall stuff? No, I don't think so, but hopefully what
you can be just as stubborn insisting that there be no funding for a border wall as you can be for funding.
$1.6 billion, and it's a baby fence, and that's it.
Real quickly, Mick Mulvaney coming in as the acting chief of staff. What do you think of that?
I think that he has a great relationship with President Trump, and I think that that was what he was really looking for, as a loyal guy. There was that clip that came out from 2016 of him saying that he's a terrible person, but hopefully he can look past that and say we've played golf together since then. We're friends, and that they can have a good relationship.
Look at all the stuff Lindsey Graham said. And,
President's a bigger man than that. I know Mick personally, brilliant, dedicated, effective.
So it's going to work
out. Can I make my negative point?
Yes.
I'm ready. Okay, so Mick Mulvaney will be the only chief of staff that actually has been confirmed by the Senate, since he's not giving up his role, which means that he can be brought in front of Congress to testify, and we could hear a lot more about what goes on in the Oval.
It's a very effective office.
You're always a hater, aren't you?
Haters gonna hate,
we're going to take
Neil.
a quick break here and discuss even more after this.